Today we will be reading The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. There was once upon a time a king and a queen who were so sorry they had no children, so sorry that it was beyond expression. They went to all the waters in the world, vows, pilgrimages, everything was tried and nothing came of it. At last, however, the queen was with child and was brought to bed of a daughter. There was a very fine christening, and the princess had for her godmothers all the fairies they could find in the kingdom, of whom they found 7, that every one of them might give her a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days. By this means the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremonies of the christening were over, all the company returned to the king's palace, where there was prepared a great feast for the fairies. There was placed before every one of them a magnificent cover with a case of massive gold, wherein was a spoon, knife and fork, all of pure gold set with diamonds and rubies. But as they were all sitting down to dinner, they saw come into the hall an old fairy, whom they had not invited, because it was now above 50 years since she had been seen out of a tower, and they thought her either dead or enchanted. The king ordered her a cover, but could not give her a case of gold as the others, because they had 7 only made for the 7 fairies. The old fairy fancied she was slighted and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her heard her, and judging that she might give the little princess some unhappy gift, went as soon as they rose from the table and hid herself behind the hangings, that she might speak last and repair as much as possibly she could the evil that the old fairy might do her. In the meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her for her gift that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the wit of an angel. The third, that she should have an admirable grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play upon all kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy's turn coming next, with the head shaking more with spite than old age, she said that the princess should have her hand pierced with a spindle and die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody fell a-crying. At this very instant the young fairy came out from behind the hangings, and spoke these words aloud. "Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true, I have not power to undo entirely what my ancient has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a profound sleep which shall last 100 years, at the expiration of which a king's son shall come and awake her." The king, to avoid the misfortune told by the old fairy, caused immediately proclamations to be made, whereby everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to spin with a distaff and spindle, or to have so much as any spindle in their houses. About 15 or 16 years after, the king and queen being gone to one of their houses of pleasure, the young princess happened one day to divert herself into running up and down the palace. When going up from one apartment to another, she came into a little room on the top of a great tower, where a good old woman was spinning with her spindle. The good woman had never heard of the king's proclamation against spindles. "What are you doing there?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," said the old woman, who did not know who she was. "Ha," said the princess, "this is very pretty. How do you do it? Give it to me, that I may see if I can do it." She had no sooner taken it into her hand than, whether being very hasty at it, somewhat unhandy, or that the decree of the fairy had so ordained it, it ran in her hand, and she fell down in a swoon. The good old woman, not knowing very well what to do in this affair, cried out for help. People came in from every quarter in great numbers. They threw water upon the princess's face, unlaced her, struck her on the palms of her hands, and rubbed her temples with Hungary water, but nothing would bring her to herself. And now the king, who came up at the noise, bethought himself of a prediction of the fairies, and judged very well that this must necessarily come to pass, since the fairies had said it, caused the princess to be carried into the finest apartment in the palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. One would have taken her for a little angel, she was so very beautiful, for her swooning away had not diminished one bit of her complexion. Her cheeks were carnation, and her lips like coral. She had only her eyes shut, but they heard her breathe softly, which satisfied them that she was not dead. The king commanded they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly till her hour of awakening was come. The good fairy who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep 100 years was of the kingdom of Matakin, 12,000 leagues off, when this accident befell the princess. But she was informed of in an instant by a little dwarf who had boots of 7 leagues. That is, boots which she could tread over 7 leagues of ground at one stride. The fairy came away immediately, and she arrived about an hour after in a fiery chariot drawn by dragons. The king handed her out of the chariot, and she proved everything he had done. But as she had a very great foresight, she thought when the princess should awake, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace, and this was what she did. She touched with her wand everything that was in the palace except the king and queen, governesses, maid of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, scullions, guards, with their beef eaters, pages, footmen. She likewise touched all the horses that were in the stables, and as well as pads and others, and the great dogs in the outward court, and pretty little Mayapan too, the prince's little spaniel, bitch that lay by her on the bed. Immediately upon touching them all, they all fell asleep, that they might not awake before their mistress, and that they might be ready to wait upon her when she wanted them. The very spits of the fire, as full as they could hold of partridge and pheasants, also slept. All this was done in a moment. The fairies are not long in doing their business. And now the king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and put forth a proclamation that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around about the park such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, twining one with one another, that neither man nor beast could pass through. So they could see nothing but the very top of the towers of the palace, and that too not unless it was a good way off. Nobody doubted but the fairy shewed herein an extraordinary piece of her art, that the princess, while she slept, might have nothing to fear from the curious. At the expiration of the 100 years, the son of the king then reigning, who was of another family from that of the sleeping princess, being gone a-hunting on that side of the country, asked what those towers were that he saw in the middle of a great thick wood. Everyone answered according to they had heard. Some said that it was an old castle haunted by spirits. Others that all the sorcerers and witches of the country kept there at their Sabbath or weekly meeting. The most common opinion was that an ogre lived there. They carried thither the little children he could catch hold of, and he might eat them up at his leisure without anybody being able to follow him, as having himself only the power to pass through the wood. Now an ogre is a giant that has long teeth and claws, with a raw head and bloody bones, that runs away with naughty little boys and girls and eats them up. The prince was in a brown study, not knowing what to believe, when an old countryman spoke to him after this manner. May it please your Royal Highness, it is now about 50 years since I heard my father say, who heard my grandmother say, that then there was a castle, and in that castle a princess, the most beautiful that ever was seen, that she must sleep there 100 years, and should be waked by a king's son for whom she was reserved. The young prince was all on fire at these words, and believing, without weighing the matter, that he could put an end to this fine adventure, and pushed only by love and honor, resolved at the moment to look into it. Scarce had he advanced towards the wood when all the great trees and bushes and brambles gave way to themselves to let him pass through. He walked up upon the castle, and he saw at the end of a large avenue which he went into. And what a little surprised him was that he saw none of his people could follow him, because the trees closed again as soon as he passed through them. However, he did not cease from continuing his way. A young and amorous prince is always valiant. He came into an outward court, where everything he saw might have frozen upon the most fearless person in horror. There reigned all over a most frightful silence. The image of death everywhere shewed itself, and there was nothing to be seen but stretched out bodies of men and animals that appeared as if they were dead. He knew, however, that very well, by the ruby faces and pimple noses of the beef eaters, that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, shewed plainly that they fell asleep in their cups. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where the guards were standing in their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring as loud as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came to a chamber all gilt with gold, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the finest sight that ever was seen, a princess that appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright resplendent beauty had somewhat in its luminous and divine. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awakened, and looking on him with eyes more tender than the first view might seem to admit of it, "It is you, my prince," and she to him, "You have waited a great while." The prince, charmed with these words, and much more with the manner they were spoken in, knew now how to shew his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. Their discourse was not well connected. They wept more than they spoke. Little eloquence, a great deal of love. He was more of a loss than she was, and we need not wonder it. She had time to think of what to say to him, for it's very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy during a long sleep had given her very agreeable dreams. In short, they talked 4 hours together, and yet they did not say half the things they had to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awaked. Everyone thought upon their particular business, and all of them were not in love. They were ready to die for hunger. The ladies of honor, being as sharp as set as other people, grew very impatient, and told the princess aloud the supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed and very magnificently, but they took care not to tell her that she was dressed like my great-grandmother. Had been peeping over a high collar, she looked a bit less beautiful and charming for all that. They went to the great hall of looking-glasses, where they supped, and were served by the princess's officers. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but very excellent. It was not above 100 years since they had been played, and after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Aylmer married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honor drew the curtains. They slept very little. The princess had no occasion, and the prince left her the next morning to return into the city, where his father must needs have been in pain for him. The prince told him that he lost his way in the forest, and he was hunting, and that he had lain into a collier's cottage, who gave him cheese and brown bread. The king, his father, who was a good man, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded. This was true, and seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, that he had always had an excuse ready for so doing. Though he had lain out 3 or 4 nights together, she began to suspect he had some little amour, for he lived with the princess above 2 whole years, and had by her 2 children, the eldest of which was a daughter, who named Morning, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day, because he was a great deal more handsome and beautiful than his sister. The queen spoke several times to her son to inform herself of what manner he passed his life, and that in this he thought it his duty to satisfy her, but he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared, though he loved her, for she was the races of ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her vast riches. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogress's inclinations, and when she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to refrain from falling upon them, and so the prince would never tell her one word. But when the king was dead, which happened about 2 years afterwards, he saw himself lord and master. He declared publicly his marriage. He went in a great ceremony to conduct his queen to the palace. They made a magnificent entry into the capital city, in which she rode between her 2 children. Some time after, the king went to make war with Emperor Catalabala, his neighbor. He left the government of the kingdom to the queen his mother, and earnestly recommended to her care his wife and children. He was obliged to continue his expedition all the summer, and as soon as he departed, the ogress mother sent her daughter-in-law and her children to a country house in the woods, that she might with greater ease put in execution her horrible desires. Some few days afterwards she went thither herself, and said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I have a mind to eat little Morning for my dinner tomorrow." "Ah, madam," said the clerk of the kitchen, "I will have it so," said the ogress, and this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat. "And I'll eat her with sauce Robert." The poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with an ogress, took his great knife and went up into little Morning's chamber. She was then 4 years old, and came up him jumping and laughing to take him about the neck and ask him for some sugar candy. upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hands. He went into the backyard and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such good sauce that his mistress assured him she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken up little Morning and carried her to his wife to conceal her in the lodging he had at the bottom of the courtyard. About 8 days afterwards, the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I'll sup upon little Day." He answered not a word, being resolved to cheat her as he had done before. He went to find out little Day, and saw him with his little file in his hand, with which he was fencing with a great monkey. He was then only 3 years of age. He took him up on his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in his lodgings along with his sister, and dressed in the room of little Day a young kid very tender, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. This was all very well hitherto, but one evening the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I'll like the queen with the same sauce as I had with her children." It was now the poor clerk of the kitchen despaired of being able to deceive her. The young queen was past 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had slept. Her skin was somewhat hard, though fair and white, and how to find in the yard a beast so firm? What was that what puzzled him? He took them a resolution, but he might save his own life, to cut the queen's throat, and going up into her chamber with intent to do it at once, he put himself into a great fury as he could possibly, and came to the young queen's chamber with his dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her with a great deal of respect the orders he had received from the ogress. Do it," said she, holding on her neck and white as snow, as alabaster. "Execute your orders, and I shall go and see my children, my poor children, whom I so much and so tenderly loved," for she thought them dead ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. "No, no, madam," said the poor clerk of the kitchen, all in tears. "You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. But then you might go home with me to my lodgings, where I have concealed them, and I shall deceive the queen once more, by giving her in your stead a young hind." Upon which he conducted her immediately to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and cry along with them, he went and dressed a hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured with the same appetite as if she had been the young queen. She was very well pleased with her cruelty, and she invented a story to tell the king his return, how the mad wolves had eaten up the queen his wife and her 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling around about the courts and palace yards to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in the ground room little Day crying, for his mamma was going to whip him because he had been very naughty, and she heard at the same time little Morning begging pardon for her brother, telling her mamma he would be good and would never do so any more. The ogress knew presently the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had been thus deceived, she commanded next morning by break of day, with a most horrible voice which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she caused to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all kinds of serpents, in order to have thrown into it the queen and her children, the clerk of the kitchen, his wife and maid, who she had given orders should he all be brought thither with their hands tied behind them. They came accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub, when the king, who they did not expect so soon, entered the court on horseback, for he came post, and asked with much astonishment, "What's this horrible spectacle meant?" No one dared to tell him, when the ogress, all enraged to see what had happened, threw herself head foremost into the tub, and was devoured in an instant by the ugly creatures she had ordered to be thrown into for the others. The king could not be very sorry, for she was his mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and his pretty children. The end.